Another pattern you might use to code better composables is using dynamic return values. In this lesson, we'll look at what these are, how to implement them, and then look at two more examples inside the ViewUse library. Here in the ViewUse library, there's a useInterval composable. It's a reactive counter that increases on every interval. You can see it's firing every 200 milliseconds. Let's take a look at how to use this. Down here, you might notice that we can either return a single constant or multiple constants. That gives us some nice flexibility, but JavaScript doesn't do this by default. So how do we code dynamic return values? Here's one way we can implement this inside of our useComposable composable. First step is to add a controls option to let the composable know we want alternate return values. Here you can see I have a controls option which is defaulting to false. Next, we can use this controls option to change the return statement. So if we have controls, we can return multiple values in an object, and if we don't, we can return a single value. This is a pattern we can find over and over again inside ViewUse. Let's take a look. First, inside the useInterval composable. Here's one way we can call this composable, and as we saw a minute ago, we can get multiple return values, and that's because we're sending in controls true into the options argument. Let's take a look inside the source code. Before we unpack the options, we have a problem, and that is that in the code here, we can't use the term controls because we're using that as the return value of useInterval function. To get around this problem, we're going to rename controls from our options argument to exposeControl, and that will default to false. That fixes our problem, and then if exposeControls is true, we'll return an object with a counter and the controls that got returned from useInterval function. Else, we'll return just the counter. That's all there is to it. Now let's take a look at one more example from ViewUse. Here is the useNow documentation. It gives us the reactive current date instance. And if we look at how to use it, we'll see that it returns either now or it returns multiple objects, now, pause, and resume. And notice it's sending in the controls true option. Let's look at how this works inside the source code. Here inside of useNow, we have controls, and once again we rename controls to exposeControls. Then we run a bunch of code here. Just pay attention here to the fact that we have controls again, and we again call the useInterval function. Then, if exposeControls is true, we return now and the controls. Otherwise, we return just now. This is the same return value pattern as useInterval. And inside ViewUse, we can find this implemented in a couple different composables, specifically useTimeout, useTimestamp, and useTimeAgo. As you saw in this lesson, using dynamic return values allows us to create powerful composables that are also very flexible.